There's a peculiar kind of power that never needs a throne, never needs an army of its own, and never needs to win a single battle, and for nearly 3 centuries, one family in Florence mastered it more completely than any king in Europe. They never called themselves rulers. Officially, for most of their history, they held no formal title at all. And yet popes owed them money, kings sought their approval, and entire wars were financed, delayed, or ended based on decisions made inside a single counting house on a narrow Florentine street. This is the story of a family that figured out something most monarchs never fully understood, that owning the money is a more durable form of power than wearing the crown, because crowns can be seized, but debts have to be repaid. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Medici didn't start as aristocrats. They started as merchants in a crowded, competitive Florentine marketplace, one family among dozens of others trying to make a living moving wool, silk, and eventually money. What set them apart wasn't noble blood. Florence, as a republic, was deeply suspicious of exactly that kind of inherited privilege. What set them apart was a decision, made in the late 14th century by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, to build a banking business structured differently from anything Europe had really seen before. Giovanni organized the Medici Bank as a network of semi-independent partnerships across multiple cities: Rome, Venice, Geneva, eventually London and Bruges, rather than one centralized operation. Each branch operated with its own local partners and its own books, which meant that if one branch failed or ran into political trouble, it wouldn't necessarily bring down the entire enterprise. This wasn't just smart accounting. It was an early form of risk management that let the Medici operate across borders and political systems that were often hostile to each other, without exposing the whole family fortune to any single conflict. But the real masterstroke was choosing the right client. In 1397, the Medici became the official bankers to the papacy, an institution that needed enormous sums moved constantly across Europe to fund everything from building projects to political maneuvering to outright warfare. Handling the Pope's money meant the Medici weren't just wealthy. They were plugged directly into the financial bloodstream of Western Christendom's most powerful institution, and every transaction that flowed through their hands generated fees, information, and leverage that no rival banking family could easily match. Here's a detail that surprises most people: much of the plumbing of modern international finance, the systems that let money move safely across borders without physically shipping gold, has roots that trace directly back to innovations the Medici and their contemporaries refined during this period. Moving actual coins across medieval Europe was slow, expensive, and dangerous. Roads were unsafe, and a chest of gold was an obvious target. The solution the Medici helped popularize was the bill of exchange, essentially a written promise that let a merchant deposit money in one city and withdraw an equivalent amount, in a different currency, in another city entirely, without a single coin ever making the physical journey. A merchant in London could pay a supplier in Florence using nothing but paper and trust in the Medici network to honor it on the other end. This solved 2 problems simultaneously. It made large-scale international trade dramatically safer and faster. And it let the Medici quietly sidestep the Catholic Church's official prohibition on usury. Charging interest was technically forbidden, but the exchange rates built into these cross-currency transactions functioned as interest in every practical sense, just wearing a legal disguise the Church was willing to tolerate. The family that banked for the Pope had found a way to profit from lending money, without technically breaking the Pope's own rules against it. By the 1430s, under Cosimo de' Medici, the family's wealth had grown large enough to become something more than financial. It became political, but in a form almost nobody in Europe had quite seen executed this carefully before. Florence was officially a republic, proud of its elected councils, and deeply hostile to any citizen who looked like they were trying to become a prince. Cosimo understood this instinctively, and instead of seizing formal power, he built something far harder to dislodge: a web of financial obligation. He extended loans to political allies. He funded the campaigns and careers of officials who would owe him favors. He positioned family members and loyal associates into key government offices, not through force, but through an accumulated web of debts, favors, and quiet understanding about whose interests would be protected. The result was a city that remained, on paper, a republic with elected officials and public votes, while in practice, very little of consequence happened in Florence without Cosimo's approval. He held no crown, no formal title beyond ordinary citizen, and yet foreign ambassadors understood perfectly well that the real seat of power in Florence sat inside a bank, not inside the government palace. When Cosimo died, the city itself granted him a title no living Florentine had ever received: Pater Patri, father of the country, an honor reserved, until that point, only for the dead heroes of ancient Rome. The Medici understood something else that set them apart from merely wealthy families of their era. Raw financial power fades from memory quickly, but art, architecture, and culture last for centuries. So they spent extraordinarily on both. Under Cosimo, and even more dramatically under his grandson Lorenzo, a man history would come to call Lorenzo the Magnificent, the family funneled enormous sums into patronage. They funded Brunelleschi's dome for the Florence Cathedral, an engineering achievement so difficult that no one in Europe had successfully built anything like it in centuries. They supported Botticelli, Michelangelo in his youth, and dozens of other artists whose names are still recognized 600 years later. They built libraries, funded philosophical academies, and positioned Florence as the undisputed cultural capital of the emerging Renaissance. This wasn't simply generosity. It was one of the most effective reputation laundering strategies in European history. A family whose fortune was built on banking, an occupation the Church still officially viewed with theological suspicion, transformed itself, one commissioned masterpiece at a time, into the patron of Western civilization's greatest artistic flowering. Nobody remembers the exact terms of a 15th-century loan agreement. Everybody remembers the dome of Florence Cathedral, and the ceiling the family's patronage helped make possible. The Medici had discovered that spending money on beauty could buy something banking alone never could: legitimacy. If banking gave the Medici money, and Florentine politics gave them local power, their next move gave them influence across the entire Catholic world. In 1513, a Medici family member became Pope Leo X. Later, another became Pope Clement VII. For a family that had built its fortune managing the Vatican's finances, having its own blood sitting on the throne of St. Peter represented an almost unimaginable convergence of financial, political, and spiritual authority. This access came with genuine consequences for European history. Medici popes were deeply entangled in the political and religious crises of their era, including the early years of the Protestant Reformation, a movement partly fueled by public anger at exactly the kind of financial practices, indulgent sales, church wealth, and perceived corruption that critics like Martin Luther associated with institutions the Medici had helped finance and influence for generations. The family that had built its power on being indispensable to the Church now found itself entangled in the controversy threatening to fracture that Church permanently. Beyond the papacy, Medici daughters married into the royal houses of France, producing queens. Catherine de' Medici and later Marie de' Medici would both rule as queens of France during periods of extraordinary political turbulence. A family of Florentine bankers, within a few generations, had placed its bloodline on thrones and in the highest offices of the Church without ever needing to win a war of conquest to get there. Power built on financial leverage and careful political maneuvering, it turns out, is genuinely difficult to sustain across many generations, and the Medici eventually discovered this the hard way. Later generations proved less skilled at banking, less disciplined about reinvestment, and increasingly reliant on formal titles. By the 16th century, the family had transitioned into hereditary Grand Dukes of Tuscany, trading the subtle, informal influence of their banking-era ancestors for the more visible, more brittle trappings of conventional aristocracy. Ironically, the moment the Medici finally got their crown was roughly the moment their most distinctive form of power began fading. A formal title made them a target, a fixed point in the political landscape that rivals could organize against, rather than a diffuse, hard-to-pin-down network of financial obligation that had made them nearly untouchable for generations. The family that had ruled by remaining underneath the visible machinery of government eventually became just another aristocratic house, and like most aristocratic houses, it eventually ran out of male heirs and faded from meaningful power entirely by the mid-18th century. Here's what should feel uncomfortably familiar about all of this. The Medici playbook: accumulate financial leverage, extend it into political influence without seeking formal office, then convert wealth into cultural legitimacy through strategic patronage, has never actually gone out of use. It just changes its costume for every era. Modern versions of this pattern are easy to spot once you know what you're looking for. Private wealth funding political campaigns and policy institutes without any single donor holding elected office. Technology fortunes converted into philanthropic foundations that quietly shape public health policy, education systems, or scientific research priorities across entire countries. Family offices and private equity firms whose decisions move markets and industries more decisively than most government ministries, while remaining largely invisible to public scrutiny. None of this requires a crown. None of it ever did. The Medici proved 5 centuries ago that formal political office is often the least efficient way to actually exercise power. It's visible, contestable, and temporary. Financial leverage, quietly and patiently accumulated, has always been harder to see, harder to vote out, and harder to dislodge. The Medici never needed a crown, because a crown was never really the point. A crown can be inherited by a fool, contested by a rival, or lost on a single battlefield in an afternoon. What the Medici built instead was something more durable, a position at the center of the flow of money itself, where popes, kings, and republics all had to come to them, generation after generation, regardless of who happened to be sitting on any particular throne that decade. That's the real lesson buried in 3 centuries of Florentine banking ledgers. Formal power announces itself with titles, thrones, and armies, and history remembers exactly when it began and when it ended. Financial power rarely announces itself at all, which is precisely what makes it last. History doesn't repeat, but the family without a crown built something so effective that empires and institutions are still copying its blueprint today. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.